Well, after we spent some time in this small country, sort of city-state, if you will, of Kuwait, right next to what I just noticed now is on this globe called the Persian Gulf, but right upstream here a little bit in Basra is known as the Gulf of Basra. We went back to Iran and revisited the country where all four of us had just spent 2 years in the Peace Corps. And we revisited, I think, all of our schools, didn't we? Will's and Jenny's?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
For multiple reasons. We wanted to just go back and meet our friends and say hello and everything like that. But the other thing we also really wanted to do was to look out of the corner of our eyes and see if we could see any effect, anything that had changed that looked like it might have been the result of our having spent 2 years in that, because that's we wanted to go and meet people and have a cross-cultural experience, but we also wanted to have an impact of contributing something of value to Iran. And as it turned out, when we were coming up from Kuwait, the first place we would hit was Ahwaz, and we visited the school that Jeff and I had been at. And this was an agricultural high school, as were the others. And that was perhaps the most striking change that we encountered of any of our schools. But left me with a whole very different view of whether or not there had been any impact from my having been there. While we were at the Ahwaz High School, I had been taught English as a second language, but the other thing I had tried to do was work with the chicken operation. This was an operating farm as well as a school about agriculture. So they had cows, they had chickens, they had machinery, they had crops that Jeff worked with and so forth. But I had been working with the chickens a bit. And when I first got there as a naive young 21-year-old, I went out to watch the chicken operation. They maybe had a couple dozen chickens, not doing too much, getting fed now and then, watered now and then, sort of erratically, I thought. And getting eggs erratically, not too many, not too often. And I said, hey, we can do better than this. And so I kind of leaned on the place, but there was to do better. But there was another Iranian teacher who was the assistant principal to school who was in charge of the chicken operation. And I was this newcomer, and I was pushing kind of heavy and not running it through him the way I should have been done and later learned to do. And he kind of balked at all this, so I kind of backed off, and the rest of the year and a half there or whatever, was around and suggested things from time to time, but not heavy duty. So that when I left, things were a little better. Yes, the feeding and watering was a little more regular. The eggs were a little better production, but not day and night difference. We came back to that same school less than 1 year later. So this was probably 9-10 months at this point. And the students, of course, ran up and said hello, and we said, and one of the first things they said though was, "Have you seen the chicken production that Dee Fink has generated?" I said, "No, tell me about it." Well, it turned out this assistant principal, whose name was Dee Fink, had taken that chicken operation after we left, enlarged it, and had made it into a major regional chicken and egg production business. They were not only supplying all the eggs that the school cafeteria needed to feed all the students because they were all housed there, they were selling hatching eggs to the whole Khuzestan province. I mean, it was a major operation in 9 months. And I was just astounded. I mean, because there was no evidence of that when we had left in, May or June of the summer before. And I said, what is going on here? And my interpretation, my explanation for that is this. This may or may not be correct, but my interpretation is that when somebody comes in like I did and see something they thought they could make a change to, you need to push for change, maybe a little more diplomatic, well, for sure more diplomatically than I did. Push for change diplomatically for a while. But while you are there, they cannot make big changes without losing face. Because if they were to make big changes that you suggested, everybody else would look at them there in Ahwaz and say, "Oh, you're just doing that because that's what that young American guy said." Whereas, once I had left, he could make whatever changes he wanted, whether they were my ideas or his ideas or whatever, and they were clear to hear that. I've been pushing for that kind of operation. And they were his. And he got the credit for it, and he did it without losing face. So my suggestion to people trying to make change in countries like that, go in, diplomatically push for change, but then at some point get out and let the people who have the capability push for changes which they can now do when you're gone without losing face. It's the only way they can do it. So it was something that I wish other Peace Corps volunteers in Iran, but maybe everywhere, could do, was go back and visit their places where they had been working a year or two or three, whatever, later. And I think they would have been able to leave the area with a much more optimistic understanding of whether or not there had been any impact of their presence there and the things they pushed for. Because almost all of it, that was the most dramatic by far, but others we saw people doing things, carrying on some of the ideas after we had left. So when we left, we didn't think we had much of a change. When we came back through a year later, we saw that in fact people had picked up and made a lot of changes in these countries. So that was some of the changes we saw in that chicken operation at the school. Jeff, what did you see with some of the stuff you had been working on there when we went back?
Well, it's interesting because everything you did was successful. English teaching, chicken husbandry, sanitary engineering, everything. And everything that I did was very innovative. Bringing in the Hohenheim system of rapid rotation for the livestock, new crops, and so on, and found that virtually everything that I had done was far less productive and less scientifically based than what I had just destroyed.
Replaced.
And
yeah.
That's kind.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
replaced. Yeah. And one was these deep basin systems called the cart system. And they would put on a good deal of...
This is for the irrigation, of the pastures for the animals. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the gravitational water would flush the salts down, the heating cooling differential, the capillary water would draw the salts back up into the dikes and have a neutral planting surface. And so I destroyed that and put in border irrigation. It didn't work. Any little unevenness in the pastures, there would be salt encrusted. And it was interesting also that with the crops, USAID had actually given us that combine. Mm-hmm. And the people who were doing the harvest had no interest in the combine whatsoever, and they would waddle down the field and they would shock the grain and they'd come and put it back in the combine.
Which was stationary.
And we eliminated the cart system because we didn't want the thing having to go over dikes. And then you realized that the harvest was social. They weren't trying to be efficient. They liked to go down in threes and talk.
They wanted to keep that. Yeah.
And then with the new crops brought in our very kind
new kind of seed, you mean?
John Rhodes from my district in Arizona, a representative. He kept sending this stuff, and one of them was the called Atlantic alfalfa, developed at Cornell. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, this incredibly vigorous alfalfa, planted it, and it just emerged and just went, it died almost immediately. And not quite immediately, but
sooner than you wanted.
And then just across, in these local farmers were planting Baghdadi alfalfa, and it was this huge thing, and like 4 cuttings a year, and so on. And I realized later, once I could slip out of my arrogance, that actually alfalfa was domesticated there. They'd been growing this stuff for several thousand years, maybe 10,000 years or so. Yeah. And it was a lesson that I'd learned, that we should first, instead of going out and being helpful and so on, should first figure out what they're doing and why they're doing it.
So, now, did you have any, when you talked to people at the school about the alfalfa and the irrigation and stuff like that, did you get a sense that they saw it the way you were seeing it just now? I mean, were they going to continue with what you'd introduced or revert back, or did you get any sense of that?
They were heavily engaged in modernization.
So they were ready to buy new is better.
What I was doing, and we also translated the pamphlets from the University of Arizona Extension Farm, and they had greater confidence in my failures than they did in the
their neighbors' successes. Yeah.
in the historical developments in the area.
Yeah. So you introduced some change, and you saw that it maybe wasn't as good, and unfortunately you were worried that they might have put more faith in it than in the change than they should.
Yeah, I think that I set them back maybe 2,000 years, and but in the whole sort of scheme of things, if alfalfa had been domesticated for 10,000 years, 2,000 years, you know, they'll get back to it.
They'll get back to it.
They'll figure it out.
Yeah.
No, it was interesting though that they and it was like we saw elsewhere the pigeon towers. Yeah. And so on. The Iranians knew that once you harvest a crop and ship it, distribute it, that you're distributing nutrients. Mm-hmm. And so rather than chemical fertilizers or whatever we would have been using now, they had these pigeon towers, and the pigeon droppings were be scooped up and used in the agricultural system. So the pigeons were importing nutrients.
And collecting it in one site for them.
Yeah. And of course some of them of course were eaten as well.
Yeah.
And
the sick and the lame.
But
right.
But it was interesting how really sophisticated their agriculture was, and how little appreciated it was.
Now this is a theme you've spoken of before on this trip, seeing it in different places of Africa, the Middle East, as well as here in Iran, of where part of what happened to you was gaining this much bigger appreciation for what had been developed over the centuries and even millennia in terms of various things: city planning, water, agriculture, irrigation, things like that. And this turned out to be another example of that, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think it's largely because they're adaptations to existing environmental systems. We in the West tend to try to manipulate the systems in some favorable way. And found, for example, this is an example from Africa, but where Yvonne was involved in these programs, the eradication of locust and granivorous birds, and the local populations just love the locusts and granivorous birds. They said that the locusts, you get these swarms and the ground swarm, and you dig a trench and you can scoop them up, and it's just wonderful. And the granivorous birds, with mist nets, you could catch them, easily, and we keep trying to combat them and try to sort of make that stop happening. And so working with natural systems is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so these are some of the things then we saw at our school between the chicken operation and the field irrigation and so forth, the growing of the alfalfa. But after we'd visited there and made some observations, we headed up the west side of Iran to Kermanshah, I think, and did we stop and visit there or go on from there? I don't recall. I remember going through Kermanshah. I don't remember a lot.
We went up through Haftepe.
Just a little north of Afwaz.
Plantation, and that's Khuzestan, where we lived. It's named for sugarcane. And then the Pahlavi Dam, Dezful, and so on, then northward and then westward to Kermanshah.
Okay.
And then into Will's bailiwick.
Yeah, up in Tabriz, the very northwest corner there. And gave Willard a chance to visit his school and visit with people and also kind of look at things there. Well, when we got up to Tabriz, the big thing that I remember was meeting the Kuhn family. What was his first name? Do you remember?
Carlton.
Same as his. So what I remember is he was the son of a famous anthropologist, written a lot of books, and one of which I later used for some of my geography and history teaching. But the son was in the State Department there in Tabriz at the head of the consulate, I think.
Right.
And we made contact with them and hit it off, and they enjoyed visiting with us. And we had a great visit with them. And he was really knowledgeable. He and his wife both were really knowledgeable about that whole area, well, Iran generally, but also that northern corner of Iran. But the big thing I remember was they're taking us out to this one unique village. Chanawan, I think was the name of it, just southeast of Tabriz, I think. And it was unusual because the whole village was on like the side of a mountain, or was a volcanic mountain, or just
it was volcanic ash, basically.
Yeah, and the ash had formed, the tufa had formed over this whole area these cones of. But what the people had done, the cones were solid enough that they were able to build their houses right into them. That is, they could carve out a room or several rooms, and the structure held, and so their whole village was into these cones that were scattered around. Right. And so they took us there, and we got to meet him. I guess we stayed, I don't know, a day overnight. It seemed like we stayed overnight. Had some pictures of the place that we can show on our website here. But it was just amazing to see that utilization of a very unique kind of geological formation, as well as to see what they were doing with the community activities and agriculture and livestock or whatever they were doing there. That was probably my big memory of that whole visit to Tabriz. Did you have other things that you were recalling from that?
Not so much. There were a few things. One was just really the comments that Tabriz was the second largest city in Iran at the time. Yeah. But it was like a village.
Yeah, still small.
It was just like a huge village. But one of the other things I remember is with Carlton Kuhn was going out into the countryside to old cemeteries looking for headstones with rams, depicting rams' heads, because it represented the distribution of Nestorian populations. The Nestorian
early Christians in that area. Yeah.
And so they were using cemetery records to sort of document settlement.
Wow.
And I remember another small village just to the south and east of Tabriz that was devoted entirely to making pickles. And we got these tins of pickles that it was interesting because Carlton Kuhn, one of the father, he used to speak of the mosaic. The Middle East is a mosaic. There was all these little specialized skills and so on, the guilds and guild-like associations and so on. And so I was surprised to find a whole village devoted to pickles.
Well, that was one of the things that happened on the whole trip, but that's just another classic example of it. We'd in Africa, and here we are in the Middle East in Iran, and we'd come onto a place where there was some food in abundance or very cheap, and on our trip we would buy it up, and for the next several days eat a lot of that. Right. And what I remember is at any particular moment our diet wasn't particularly balanced, but over the course of 6 months we got a little this, little this, little this all the way along, and that was one of those. Well, let me turn to our globe here. Tabriz is right up here Iran is this green area here, and Tabriz is right up in this northwest corner. What we did after we left Tabriz was come up here and drive along the southern edge of the Caspian Sea, which is especially interesting because it doesn't show it on the globe here, but there's the Alborz, right? Am I getting that right? The Alborz Mountains right there. And when the winds come off the Caspian and hit the Alborz, it drops all of its rain on the north side, which really gives that particular region, that coastal region, a unique geography in all of Iran, because most of Iran is either arid or semi-arid, but that coastal littoral area there is high rainfall. And so you get a whole different kind of human settlement. We saw a lot of rice fields. We saw the houses not with mud thatched walls, but at least with thatched roofs to shed the rainfall quickly. And you saw people out working in the rice fields doing all the type of things you typically do there. So it gave us we had been down in the southwest when we were at our school and getting that semi-arid kind of climate. But to go up there and travel along that and see that very different kind of landscape and climate and so forth was neat. The thing I remember was the rice fields and the thatched roofs. The other things you had around there?
One of the things that I remember about it is the tea plantations.
Oh yeah, that's
And
right.
I'll sort of get back to that when we get to India. But also, as we're coming into the area, there were on the Soviet side, there are these watchtowers or whatever. And I remember at one of them, they actually announced our arrival. They knew who we were,
Yeah.
where we'd been,
Really?
where we're
I
going.
forgot about that. Yeah.
And they did it almost sort of as in humor,
Yeah.
as a joke.
Yeah. So here we are making a website to tell the world about what we did. We should just go and check with the Russians. They, probably, they were following us all the way along here. Who knows? Yeah.
But the Caspian was interesting. It's very thickly vegetated outside of the rice plantations and the tea plantations and so on. And of course, the fishery is, is important.
Well, why don't you say more about the kind of fish they had there and the special, what comes out of that?
Caviar, I think is the principal product of the area.
The sturgeon fish that big appetite in the whole Caspian Sea.
The sturgeon, and it's a contested area because it's a petroleum producing area, especially Azerbaijan, but on this side as well.
Around Baku there.
And so it's contested as to whose chunk of the lake is whose. And the Caspian Sea is actually a lake. It's fresh water, and it's a fascinating area. And the population. Do you remember the Gilakis and people used to make sort of fun of different groups because they were so distinctively different.
Yeah.
And
a lot of the sort of spatial jokes, like we used to say about Polish or whoever, Polak jokes and so forth. The Gulakis had their jokes about them.
Oh, and the other thing that was interesting. When this edge of the lake that we visited actually after coming
down
up
to Tehran.
This is what I was mentioning earlier was a Viking trading settlement.
Yeah,
which is fascinating.
Yeah, I did some reading here recently about the Vikings and how we think of them in the West as going west across the Atlantic, but which a lot of them did, but a lot of them came down the rivers of East and Southeast Europe and into the Caspian, found their way down there, and it's just amazing how far into Eurasia, if you will, they went, which we don't hear much about, but there they were.
Yep.
But anyway, so after we visited the Caspian area, then we came down to Tehran for a while, did some work on the vehicle, checked in with the Peace Corps, met some of the new people who had been in the Peace Corps behind us. Were any people there that you recall or stories you want to share with?
Not really. I was always struck by the fact that you and Will or others had sort of ferreted out these people with whom we would stay.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering as I was going over this sort of material, how did we get to know people well enough to settle in their apartments?
Yeah, that they would bring us in, and that happened frequently on this.
And I think that it's just that people overseas, they're interested in travelers and travelers' stories.
And
so we were
the hospitality we ran into, both of local folks but also expatriates living in that area, was what was both remarkable but also very helpful to us, not only as a place to stay, but also you talk and you hear what they have learned about the area and region, and same was this case, and they were learning from us, and in this case the subsequent volunteers. But then after we left Iran, we went up again sort of coast and then over to Mashhad, the big city in the northeast part of Iran, before we would take off to Afghanistan. And Mashhad is one of the two biggest religious centers in Iran, the other one being Qom. And a major shrine there for one of the saints of Shia Islam. And we spent some time in that town, could feel the strength of the high protectors of Islam, Shia Islam, that were present in that city. I don't remember a lot more other than just that big shrine, and we spent some time there. And how this is a piece of architecture. It's an amazing shrine. I don't know if you had other things about it that you recall.
Not specific, but as I don't know, it was of interest to me, the architecture.
Yeah.
And because there are any number of medieval mosques and that had been there for hundreds of years, And this is a seismically active zone.
Mm-hmm.
And in the architecture, they would have a lower level of unbaked brick that absorbed the shock of earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just so surprised at these architects, the way they would manipulate sound and the light and so on. And they connected with the, and this had gone on for hundreds of years. They would pipe in methane from the restroom area to heat the water for bathing or for
keep the water warm,
cleansing
for body
themselves.
temperature.
And it was so sophisticated, and it's something that we had found a little bit with regard to Ur in Iraq just before coming into Iran. And just there they would have these convectional cells, slots in the bottom, and then warming, and so you had a cool breeze. And these structures that were pre-Christian. I mean, they were incredibly old.
Yeah.
And I think that we dismiss all that because of our idea of progress. And the inevitability of modernization.
The
and
enormous sophistication that we just don't see because we haven't checked it out.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we saw when we left Mashhad and started heading over towards Afghanistan, we saw them both in northeastern Iran and western Afghanistan, were these tall wind towers. Do you want to explain what those were doing and what those were all about?
They were for milling grain, but were enormous. I mean, really large structures encased in with sort of an opening to capture the flow of wind and turn the mill wheel. But it was such massive systems, and they were, to my knowledge, unique. I've never heard of.
Well, that was the thing that struck me about them. You know, we always think of windmills as having a horizontal shaft and the wind going around this way, but these things were, the main shaft was vertical,
right,
and the blades went around this way.
Spin around this way, And this area, unlike much of Afghanistan, is Tajik, Persian-speaking, and it's connected with this area to the north. So it's possible that some of that technology came from the north, but I hadn't seen it there either. And have spent quite a bit of time there as well.